Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, distinguished lecturers, I think from the Vienna University. I know that the master ceremony has already introduced me, but please allow me to introduce myself again. My name is Poppy. Easy, isn't it? So the long name is quite long, but you can call me Poppy. I'm lecturer at the International Relations Department, Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, just next door. So if you have any chance, for those who are coming from overseas, please come by to my faculty. It's just next door. I've been teaching at the International Relations Department probably around, since 2000. And my focus of area is more like international political economy, regionalism, international trade, and all those stuff. So even though I'm teaching at the International Relations Department, but my focus is more like political economy. So today's session, I'll be talking more about the ASEAN geopolitical environment and also regional economy. But since we have a very limited time, so I would like to frame today's session as an introduction. Because if we want to study more about all these topics, then I don't think 2 hours would be enough. Before I continue, I'm just wondering how familiar you are with ASEAN. Do you know how many countries are the member of ASEAN? Anyone? 11. Since when? How many countries, how many members that ASEAN has? How many? No? Raise your hand, probably. Some of you coming from the ASEAN universities, right? Well, UGM, obviously. Some from Thailand. Anyone from Thailand? No? Oh, okay. The Philippines? No? Malaysia? Okay, good. Anyone from ASEAN? No? I'm just wondering, especially from students from Vienna. Do you know how many ASEAN members that we have? Yes, please. 10. Okay, good. Do you know what they are? Oh, I just mentioned some of them. Indonesia, obviously, yes. Okay, yes. Yes. Right? Yes. Yes. Anyone probably would like to help? Oh, yes. Cambodia, Vietnam, yes, you mentioned it already. Myanmar, I think, yes, Laos. Brunei has already mentioned. Vietnam is already mentioned. Philippines, yes, and Cambodia, yes. Unfortunately, Timor-Leste, to be precise, is not yet the member of ASEAN. Timor-Leste has been trying to be the member of ASEAN, but still in the process of negotiation. If we have time, probably then we can discuss it. But then we're not going to talk about it as a focus of today's discussion. Okay, ASEAN has 10 members, including obviously Indonesia, and you mentioned Indonesia is one of the founding fathers of ASEAN. We're going to discuss this, the geopolitical environment. Yes, thank you. So we're going to cover these topics. Obviously, we're going to have more understanding about ASEAN, its political and economic relations, and then a little bit about the ASEAN regional economy, why it is important, and why then, when we're talking about the ASEAN regional economy, it cannot be separated from the geopolitical situation. And how then the ASEAN objectives to achieve what we call as the single market in ASEAN will be much more influenced by the fact about the geopolitical situation in this region. So we need to also cover what it means by the geopolitics. And obviously, the main focus of today's discussion is on the ASEAN geopolitical environment. Next, please. Well, this is the basic information about ASEAN. The first thing, ASEAN is home for more than 630 million people. The numbers, I should mention that the numbers are a bit kind of disputable. Some say more than 630, some say even like up to 650 million people. One of the reasons is also because we in Indonesia also sometimes the numbers about our population is also different. So some people say it's more than 250 million people. So that can also influence why the numbers of the populations in ASEAN can also be, depends on which institutions that, release the numbers. But some argue that we are more than 630 million people. So many people, isn't it? 630 million people means that ASEAN is also one of the biggest markets in the world, right? Anyone can compare with the EU? How many populations in the EU? Yes? Wow, 530? Around 530 million people. So even in ASEAN, we have more. Even in EU, you have more members, but then ASEAN has more populations with the 630 million, more than 630 million people. So at this moment, ASEAN is regarded collectively, obviously, equivalent to the world's sixth largest economy. However, some predict that in the near future, 2030, it will be predicted that ASEAN will become the fourth largest single market. So it means that altogether, all these 10 ASEAN members will become the fourth largest single market in the world. And you know who's the first? The largest market? The latest data shows it's still the US is the largest. The first is the US, the second is China, the third, EU, yes, obviously. And then we're going to be predicted as the fourth. Currently, after the EU, still Japan. ASEAN is still either fifth or the sixth largest economy at this moment, but it will be predicted by 2030, it will be like the fourth largest economy. It depends on how, and we're going to discuss it later, how then the ASEAN is achieving what we call as the single market ASEAN economic community later. And then, interestingly about ASEAN, that ASEAN is home for diverse political system. You know what I mean by political system? Indonesia is proud of saying that we're one of the democratic countries in ASEAN. Yes? Where are the Indonesians here? Are you proud of it? Yes, obviously yes. Even though after the very, very controversial last general elections, yeah, presidential elections. But Indonesia is one of the biggest or the largest democracy in ASEAN. So we have in ASEAN the largest democracy here. And then we also home for the monarchy, anyone knows? Brunei Darussalam, and then, yes, to some extent. And then we also have countries that still adopting political system, what we call as the single party communist state. Vietnam, yes. And then the vibrant democracy including Indonesia and what else? Depends. Singapore, to some extent, semi sort of thing. It's not completely democratic system. It is. Some say that not really sort of completely democratic yet. Some even say that it's almost like semi-authoritarian system. But we have the vibrant democracy including Indonesia, the Philippines. Those are ASEAN members that still adopt what we call as the democratic political systems. The absolute monarchy including Brunei, to some degree, Malaysia also still has the monarchy, Thailand still has the monarchy. So you can imagine in a region like ASEAN, we accommodate a various systems, political systems here. From the vibrant democracy till the single party communist state, and then we also have some semi-authoritarian regime. ASEAN has these characteristics from home for that sort of like populations, huge populations, very huge potential for the markets, largest economy in the world, and also vibrant and various political system. But more importantly about ASEAN is situated in what we call as the geostrategic location. I will show you the map later. If you still cannot imagine, even though you are now here in Indonesia as one of the ASEAN countries, but sometimes we cannot figure out where we are, right? Especially if you're coming from far away from Indonesia then. So we'll see. ASEAN is in what we call as a very geostrategic location. It means that it's a very critical, both in terms of the security, political issues, and also the economic relations, including trade. So how then, we're going to discuss how these geostrategic locations of ASEAN is influencing the way the dynamics of the region and the way the region is developing into what we call as the single market later on. Next, please. So, before we're discussing the geopolitical situation, this is just a brief introduction about what we aim for, what we want to achieve as the single market, or you are familiar with the terms of the ASEAN Economic Community. Basically, ASEAN Economic Community is only one of the communities that aim by ASEAN member countries. That includes the ASEAN Economic Community, ASEAN Political Community, and ASEAN Society. So what we want to discuss further here is the economic community. What we mean by the ASEAN Economic Community is the effort to make ASEAN as a single market that comprises of those 10 ASEAN members. You have to remember, ASEAN was first established not because of the economic relations, but due to the geopolitical situations back then. I think I've put the info here. No? When was the ASEAN established? No, that's not there. Yes, unfortunately, I don't bring anything. Usually I bring something for those who can answer my questions. But sometimes, I forgot, sorry about that. But anyway, ASEAN was established in 1967. I know probably most of us here weren't born yet at that time. No, sorry. I don't think so. 1967. What happened during that period? What happened? Yes. Confrontation between, in a global sense, Malaysia, Indonesia was only tip of the iceberg. The Cold War, yes, which was what? The Cold War was what? The war between the two blocks, right? What we call as the communist bloc and what? One was under the US leadership, yes? And then the other one is under the USSR leadership. So the world was virtually divided between two blocks, the West and the East. ASEAN was established during that kind of conditions. ASEAN was established in order to, at that time, to attain what we call as peace, security, and the stability in the region. Why? Because the world was divided into these two blocks, and there has been a very strong effort to put ASEAN into these two blocks. So ASEAN was established in that kind of condition. And we have to remember at that time that was the main sort of like objective of ASEAN. The economic cooperation came later, not as part of the initial reasons why ASEAN was established. During the ASEAN's early development, here you can read it, it wasn't seen as an urgent matter. At that time, how then ASEAN can be situated during the Cold War between these two blocs. Economic relations wasn't seen as an urgent matter at that time. As time goes by, we can see the economic relations started to become one of the important aspects of ASEAN, started as early as 1970s. And then it became a very crucial aspect early 1990s, when then ASEAN started to establish what we call as the free trade area within ASEAN. So when you heard about the ASEAN Economic Community, some people said it's a new thing. Basically, it's not. ASEAN has started to think about economic relations in a deeper meaning, started back to early 1990s. Even though the aspect at that time was only what we call as the free trade area, meaning the cooperation was concentrating only at aiming to reducing the tariff barriers among these member countries. We haven't discussed a very deeper sort of like economic relations at that time. So that what makes what we call as the ASEAN Economic Community lately completely different what we seen as 1992 ASEAN Free Trade Area. ASEAN Free Trade Area at that time was a very limited cooperation, only to increase trade relations among the ASEAN members, and mostly focusing on goods, trades in goods, right? So very limited, and then a very slow progress, because 1992, and then the idea about the ASEAN Economic Community was only came into the discussion late 1990s or early 2000. Until 2015, finally, ASEAN agreed to have what we call as the ASEAN Economic Community. What are they? Next, please. Oh, this is just a very detailed information about the evolutions of the ASEAN economic cooperation. The birth of ASEAN, 1967, and until then, the idea about the ASEAN economic community came about. Next, please. So here is the elements of what we call as the ASEAN economic community. As I mentioned earlier, the ASEAN economic communities is only one of the pillars of the ASEAN community in general way. 4 pillars here. The first thing is ASEAN economic community aims to achieve what we call as the single market and production base. If you're coming from the EU, then you are more familiar with this, right? Because EU is already a single market within the EU region. Is that correct? I know that you are in sort of like questioning the future of the EU after the Brexit. That's a very interesting new phenomenon. The thing is, because EU is always seen as the examples of the successful single market, effort from all over the world. But then when Brexit came about, then people started to asking, is it really a model? Is it really something? Or what should we learn from the fact that Brexit happened in the EU? The first one is single market and production base. ASEAN aims to have this. So no longer ASEAN is regarded as a single country, but the whole 10 ASEAN members becoming a single market that then cooperate with other countries or other regions outside the ASEAN. The second pillar of the ASEAN economic community is what we call as the competitive economic region. ASEAN realize if we have, or if we are as an individual country, probably we are not as competitive as we thought. So that's why we have to be as one single unity, sort of like political unit in terms of the global market. So that will make ASEAN much more competitive in global competition. The third aspect of the ASEAN economic community is what we call as the equitable economic development. One of the reasons is because, as you know, in ASEAN, we have like 10 members of ASEAN, right? And then we have like what we call as the six largest ASEAN members, and then the newest members. You know which countries that considered as the newest members of ASEAN? Anyone knows? Myanmar, and then four members are joining later, not the original Cambodia, yes, Laos, and Vietnam, yes. Usually we call SLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. Whenever we assess ASEAN, we always grouping it as the original members of ASEAN, like the largest members, and then the newest member, or the CLMV. Why? Because the disparity between these two groups are quite diverse. We see like even in the six largest members, Singapore is way much advanced as compared to, say, like even Indonesia, for example. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, they've always been regarded as the richest members in ASEAN, and then the mid, sort of like upper middle countries, including Indonesia, the Philippines, and then the newest members, including this CMLV. So equitable economic development, not only among the ASEAN members, but also within individual country, is also one of the objectives of the ASEAN economic community. The last pillar, last but not least, even though ASEAN is achieving to become a single market, but then ASEAN is not aiming to disintegrate themselves from the world economy. It's not going to isolate themselves from the world economy. One of the pillars under the ASEAN economic community is aiming ASEAN as a single market, but still integrated into the global economy. Why? Because it is understandable. If you see the data, ASEAN members trade more with non-ASEAN members. Some countries even have like, they're having trade relations, more than 70% or 80% of their trade, international trade, are not with ASEAN members, but with non-ASEAN members. Can you guess? Yes, exactly. China is always be part of, when we're talking about the ASEAN, China is always be part of the discussion. Why? One of the reasons is because ASEAN members trade much more, not with the ASEAN members, but with non-ASEAN members, which is China. So the question is that when ASEAN is trying to achieve a single market like this, and then the data shows that the ASEAN members trade less with its own members, so what was the purpose of having the single market then, right? So how are you going to overcome these issues? Say, for example, Indonesia trade more with China than Indonesia trade more with Laos or Myanmar or probably Cambodia. And China is always the biggest trading partner for all ASEAN members. In addition to China, who's the biggest trading partners of all ASEAN members? Can you guess? India, yes, but it's not. Yes, India is included, but it's not the second largest. Can you guess? Yes, Japan. China, Japan, and what next? Korea come to the list. India come to the list. Who else? Australia, yes. So, in addition to achieving what we call as the ASEAN economic community as a single market, ASEAN members realize that we do trade much more with China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and yes, to some extent New Zealand. So that's why, in addition to achieving what we call as the ASEAN economic community as a single market, ASEAN now is trying to expand the economic relations with these additional countries, China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. And now in the process of negotiations, anyone knows what it is. What we've been trying to negotiate since the last couple of years after we aim to have ASEAN economic community, but then we realize, oh no, it's not enough. It's not going to be sufficient if it's only like ASEAN members. We have to expand it into plus these 6 members or 6 trading partners. EU, yes, but not as part of the negotiations in expanding in terms of the region. Trans-Pacific Partnership, unfortunately not. Trans-Pacific Partnership is something else. Even this is, some people even argue, Trans-Pacific Partnership is the rivalry of the thing that has been negotiating by the ASEAN countries and all these 6 members. Anyone knows what it is? Indonesia is the leading, what is it? The leading negotiator is from Indonesia. And ASEAN took lead on this process. Anyone know what has been going on? They have some meetings, including in Jogja as well, but mostly under the radar, as many other trade negotiations. Yes. Asia Pacific, but more specifically, it's regional. Have you heard the terms of the RCEP, RCEP? Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's the extension of the ASEAN members plus 6 other countries, including China, South Korea, Japan, India, Australia, and New Zealand. You can imagine, right? India is a bit kind of far, right? A bit kind of far from ASEAN. But since India is one of the biggest trading partners of ASEAN members, and ASEAN has already ASEAN and India cooperation. So basically, ASEAN has individual trade agreement with these countries. ASEAN plus 3. You know what they are? ASEAN plus 3. What they are? The 3 biggest trading partners: China, Japan, and South Korea. ASEAN has already had a trade agreement which is called as the ASEAN plus 3, which includes ASEAN, China, Japan, and South Korea. Then ASEAN has already also signed a trade agreement between ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand. Then ASEAN has already also signed an agreement, trade agreement with ASEAN and India. So, in order to make all these agreement together, ASEAN proposed a new sort of like trade agreement under the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which include basically ASEAN plus these 6 other countries. It's much more, in my personal opinion, it's much more realistic because we realize that if it's only ASEAN, we are not going to go anywhere. We are trading much more with these 6 countries rather than we're trading with each other. One of the reasons why then ASEAN trade relations is considered as low because ASEAN produce, all the ASEAN member countries produce what? similar products. So it is not complement to each other. So most of the ASEAN countries produce similar products, then we trade with others there to complement, right, the economic development of each country. So that's why it is, in my opinion, much more making sense if ASEAN has to expand it to their trading partners, including these 6 countries. Unfortunately, until now, the negotiation is still going on, is still in the process. It's a bit kind of difficult to come to an agreement again, because the disparity between these countries, Australia obviously wants to have much more advanced trading agreement, while some of the other ASEAN members are still reluctant, even to opening up their market. And China obviously wants to secure, right, the dominant and their privilege at this moment as the biggest trading partners in ASEAN. And India obviously also wants to secure some of the what we call as the protectionist trade policies to protect their own domestic producers and also market. We need to see how it goes, because it was expected to be concluded last year, but it's still ongoing at this moment. So the question again, how then ASEAN is going to achieve its objective to achieve single market, even including to expand the ASEAN economic community into a bigger and wider economic relations with the 6 partners, considering the situations that ASEAN is in a very geostrategical position. So far, is it okay? Can you follow it? Yes? Any questions so far before I continue? Yes. RCEP is the abbreviation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's the initiation led by ASEAN to have a more comprehensive trading, international trade cooperations between ASEAN and the other 6 partners. Any other? Yes.
So you said earlier the ASEAN member is trying to apply the single market policy, right? And you also said that some countries are still reluctant to the policy. So what do you think are the reason why these countries are not opening up their chances to the single market policy?
One of the reasons, okay, one of the conditions to have a single market is your willingness to opening up your domestic market. Meaning is that you have to allow or you have to reduce what you call as the trade barriers. One of the forms of the trade barriers is that you put tariff for goods that entering your domestic market, right? For some ASEAN member countries, tariffs on imported goods are still seen as their economic source, so they can get money from tariff. So that's why some countries, especially the small countries, are still reluctant. If the tariff is being zero, then they no longer have the source of the income for the country. That was one of the reasons. Another reason, obviously, some countries are still reluctant because, again, ASEAN members almost like have similar sort of like industries. So if you are opening up your domestic market for the products coming from the other ASEAN member countries, then your industry will compete with the other similar industries coming from the other ASEAN members. Initially, when we have seen the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community, some people are a bit kind of skeptical, again, because Indonesia is such a large country compared to any other ASEAN members, right? Some people are afraid that Indonesia is only becoming the market for the other products coming from the other ASEAN members countries. While on the other hand, for example, if you see the size of Singapore, how many people in Singapore? Anyone from Singapore here? Do you know the population less than Jakarta? Yes, you are right. I don't know the numbers, but it seems like less than Jakarta, right? So if then you have the business, then you want to get the access to the market, and you have Singapore and you have Jakarta. What do you choose? If you are domestic players, obviously. So some people are still reluctant, especially for the Indonesian business man, businesswoman, yeah, because they see that the size of the market domestically in Indonesia is still big as compared to if you want to expand your business to the other ASEAN member countries. While for Singaporean, for Malaysian, for Thai, they will see that the Indonesia as a big opportunity to invest their industries or probably sell their products, again, because of the size of the market. However, later on, we'll see that we can see it from more not or probably less skeptical, but more optimistic, because we are not only see ASEAN Economic Community as a single market, but it's part of what we call as the production base. So if you see that ASEAN members can produce things that they have a very good or what we call as the competitive advantage in each country, and we sell it together as part of the bigger industrial sort of like process, then it will be much more competitive rather than ASEAN member can sell their own product and compete with each other. So some companies already investing in that way, that they invest certain aspects of their products in Indonesia, certain aspects of their products in Thailand, certain aspect of their products in Malaysia, and then assembling it together and sell it as the product of ASEAN. That was much more competitive rather than producing in single country in ASEAN, in one of the ASEAN member countries, and we have to compete with each other. So that's why it is not only single market, but also a production base. So the production base is not based in individual ASEAN member, but the whole region of ASEAN. It's still ongoing, obviously, because it was just started earlier. We'll see how it goes. If then achieving single market is much more difficult, then how about like promoting ASEAN as the single production base? So we can much more have a competitive advantage compared to any other region in the global economy. So yes, that was one of the reasons. Anything else? Yes.
To what extent does this free trade negotiation, how do they affect actually also the immigration laws and the fact that people can move around ASEAN countries and work?
Yes, good question. One of the, I don't know, I like traveling. I hope that you do, yes? If you are not, then you're not going to be here, no? You're not going to come to Indonesia far, far away from your country anyway. So I like traveling. One of the good things from ASEAN cooperation is now we have something like in the EU, that all the ASEAN citizens can travel around ASEAN without visa. It was only recently introduced a couple of years ago. I think the young generations, this generation, the millennials, they're already enjoying this kind of policy that we can travel to other ASEAN countries without visa. I think our older generation, even when we want to go, I think 2004, I visited Thailand, I still had to apply for visa. That was a bit kind of troublesome, right? Because it's very short trip. But now we can visit other ASEAN countries without visa. That was one of the aspects under the ASEAN cooperation that I can see now the result of it. So much more connection among the ASEAN people, and now we know to get to know each other much more as compared to before. But then more specific issue is regarding the labor, immigrations, and all those things. Under the ASEAN Economic Community, in addition to trade in goods, ASEAN is also formulating what we call as the trade in services. You know, trade in services is including labor issues, right? So you can work in some ASEAN countries. However, under the ASEAN trade in services, what we're dealing is only for the professional sort of like work. So it's not about low-skilled laborers. It's only high professional, skillful laborers. And then if you want to work in some other ASEAN countries, now we are still in the process of negotiating. Some are already agreed regarding the certain sort of like conditions and standardization. So for example, in engineering, so if you are engineer, then you want to work in some other ASEAN countries, then you have to pass certain sort of like standardization. Then you can, once you are past that, then you are eligible to work in some other ASEAN countries. So it means that you are acknowledged to be part of this system, but only limited for some profession, not all aspects. And we are not talking about the low-skill laborers, but we are talking about the skillful laborers. Yes.
Are those profession or those regulations, are they integrated in the university system, or do you need to do those tests?
Different. Yes. So it's not attached to the university, but it is under the trade in services system, usually with the association. You are part of the engineers associations, and then those are the one can set up the standard for certain, standard for the ASEAN members that can work cross borders. I don't think we see it now as much as we expected. One of the reasons is because of the language barriers. So for example, if you're a medical doctor, then if you want to work in Indonesia, obviously that you have to speak bahasa, right? Otherwise, how can you treat patient if you can't speak the language? Those are some of the barriers about the language. It's not all professions, but all again, it's highly skillful professionals, sort of like workers. So engineering, architect, what else? Construction services, civil engineering, all those things. Then, in my opinion, those are probably much more manageable in terms of standardization. Lecturers. So those are some of the aspects that be part of the trade in services in ASEAN. Anything else? Okay, shall we continue then? So you have the big picture about what is ASEAN, yes, and what is the ASEAN Economic Community or the ASEAN Regional Economic Cooperation, yes.
Are there also political measures? Because the European Union is not only an economic union, but also a political one. But there are no intentions on extending that.
We do have an intention, if you ask the question about the intention, but my opinion in terms of the political sort of like aims in ASEAN is still lag behind as compared to the economic cooperation in ASEAN. As you can see in ASEAN member countries really respect the sovereignty of the member countries, meaning non-intervention is a very important principle under the ASEAN principle. So whenever we're talking about the political sort of like aspects, it is always had to do with how far it can be intervening to your domestic affairs. So it makes more ASEAN members much more reluctant when we're talking about the political aspects of ASEAN community. However, we see the new development regarding, say, the development of the CSOs, the civil society organizations in ASEAN, which then much more eager in promoting the human rights issues, democratization issues, and all environmental issues and all those issues in ASEAN as compared to, say, probably 10 years ago. However, again, in terms of the economic cooperation, ASEAN is, in my opinion, again, is much more advanced than any other sort of like political cooperation. Yes, you want to ask something?
Yes, but it's actually to continue this discussion and how, in order to talk trade, you have to talk economics, you have to talk about the importance of rule of law, because
Yes.
without rule of law, you cannot have free trade.
Yes.
Or the environmental standards. How does this negotiation go actually to achieve free trade without talking about the political aspects?
Well, it's not really completely separate, but when we're talking about the trade, then ASEAN members are much more focusing on how are we going to reduce the trade barriers. We are still not talking about the environmental standard together. We have some of the agreements related to transboundary haze, for example. Yes, we have some agreements regarding the human rights principles. Yes, but again, as I mentioned earlier, some of the aspects are still limited by the fact that ASEAN has the principles of the non-intervention principles. So I see what ASEAN is trying to do is trying to really sort of like focusing on economic relations and let the political relations can be built later on after it can be done through the economic relations. So we will see that kind of process. However, again, some of the civil society organizations in ASEAN are now becoming much more active. Used to be ASEAN was regarded as a very top-down sort of like decision-making process. Everything is decided by the high-level sort of like ministries and stuff. But now ASEAN is opening up much more into bottom-up process, and then we see how it goes as the organization that has still developing. I think I can see a progress in ASEAN. Even though, again, the key of the successful of ASEAN cooperation is the connection among people to people. It's not about only the states. So having this kind of, classes, courses, engaging with, people to people engagement is much more useful for the development of ASEAN in the future. Anything else? Oh, okay, yes.
So we were just talking about the trade openness and maybe cross-border transactions. And I heard something like capital economic liberalization, and that is basically. Yeah. Okay. So from what I know, it's basically like the deregulation of the capital inflows within countries in ASEAN. But from as far as my knowledge, I believe that when there is too much capital inflow, there may be some macroeconomic problems. So politically, when the state institutions step into solve these problems, what can they do to prevent these things, such as the the macroeconomic problems?
One of the things from ASEAN experience is all this process is taking step by step. So ASEAN, probably some people see it too slow, the progress is too slow. But again, it comes to the characteristics of ASEAN that really, really kind of careful in every step that it makes, including mitigating or overcoming or probably like, dealing with some sort of like expected sort of like problems or future issues and all those things. So one of the things, including the financial cooperation in ASEAN, what we have done so far is only opening up the opportunities for financial institutions to trans-ASEAN members countries, but then not beyond that yet. So we only opening up, say, some of the banks financial institutions coming from the other ASEAN countries to operate in some other ASEAN. So step by step, and we'll see how it goes. Again, because the idea about the ASEAN Economic Community was just started in 2015, right? So we're still in the process. And then I think the lesson learned is also because the ASEAN members realize there are some unintended, probably, consequences or predictions, problems, and issues that need to be anticipated. So that's why I think it's much more, some people probably, including me, see it as a very slow progress. But then to some extent, I realized that probably it has also a deeper meaning that ASEAN really need to be careful with all the economic integration that is been trying to be achieved by the ASEAN members. Okay, can I?
Thank you, ma'am.
All right. Can I continue to the next aspect first? Yes, because we're only like half of it. Yes, we'll see. Next, please. Now we're coming to the questions on how then, back to my original questions. When ASEAN has this aim to achieve a single market, and then with this kind of problem situations, and then considering the geostrategic situations of ASEAN, then how then ASEAN is able to achieve all these kind of objectives, including economic integration, single market, and all those things. One of the aspects is what we call as the geopolitical situation in ASEAN. I know I put the keywords here, but probably anyone can share their opinion. What is your opinion? How then geopolitical situation is important when we're talking about a certain country or a certain region? Why it matters? Why geopolitical is matters? Anyone? Anyone knows what it means by the geopolitics, right? Next slide, please. Oh, okay.
I would say other parties could have major interests in that area, America and US, for example, so they may not leave you alone.
Exactly. That's a very, a very simple way of understanding why it is important, why it matters to talk about the geopolitical situation of country or region like ASEAN, for example. I show you the map as I promised earlier. This is ASEAN in a bigger picture. And for those coming from Indonesia, I think you have learned from your primary education that we are sort of like, we learned that Indonesia was situated in a very strategic position, isn't it? Do you still remember that? Yes? ASEAN is also similar situation with Indonesia. ASEAN is situated between what oceans? Pacific and Indian Ocean, right? We have also bordering with Australia, another continent, yes? And then in the north, we are bordering with, what else? China, right? And when we see the map of ASEAN, it is very obvious that it is very strategic location, isn't it? Trade relation, very important. Why? If you're trading from north, from European countries, yes? Exactly. So we need to go through this area. Unless you find something shorter, faster, which is we still haven't found it yet. So Strait of Malacca is one of the busiest strait in the world that all the international trade mostly coming through this area. ASEAN obviously is there, right? Once you are part of this big international trade relations, but at the same time, you also have to face problems. What? When you are part of this sort of like, connection, what sort of problems that you have? Environmental problems, what else? Foreign interest, because they want to make sure that their goods, whatever coming through this region, must be safely, right, landed or whatever in their countries. You must also have to face all this illicit trade, right? Smuggling. Yes. Wow, very strong word. China wants to take all of the. Say that again. I'm just curious. Anyone from China here? No, no, just kidding, just kidding. No, it's all right.
China just built some random islands in all of the South China Sea, territories that would be much nearer to Vietnam, Cambodia, Singapore, whatsoever, and they say it's yours, it's theirs.
Yep, because again, a very strategic location of what we call as the South China Sea. We're going to talk about that. In addition to Malacca Strait, we also have the South China Sea, which then now has become a dispute among certain countries in ASEAN and obviously China. That was one of the issues that currently have to face by ASEAN. So at one side, ASEAN is aiming to have single market, production base, and all those things, right? And we also realize, the ASEAN also realized that China is our biggest trading partners so far. And at the same time, ASEAN locations, ASEAN situations, ASEAN's geopolitical situation puts ASEAN into this kind of conditions. That ASEAN is so attractive for some countries, including big powers surrounding this area. One of them including China. So geopolitical, in a way, is about your geographical position will influence any political decisions that will be made by the country or the regions in that area. So for example, I believe Australia is, no, not Australia. Austria is a landlocked country, is that correct? Yes? A landlocked country. So that also put Austria in a very different position in Europe and in a global political economy. Yes? You face different problems with ASEAN that, bordering with two big oceans and stuff like that. See, you know what I mean? Like when we're talking about the geopolitical situation, that you have to consider that your geographical situations may influence the political decisions of the country or the regions because of this kind of situations. So ASEAN has different problems with Austria. ASEAN has different problems in terms of their geographical situation with some other countries that probably because of, again, their geographical situations are different. Now we see, here we have the Pacific Oceans, we have the Indian Ocean, some of the ASEAN countries bordering directly with, like Indonesia, we're bordering with Timor-Leste and Australia, Papua New Guinea, right? The Philippines have borders with China, Japan, and then Laos has border with, again, China, Myanmar, sorry, that was still Burma, has borders with Bangladesh and all those countries. So that influenced the way ASEAN behave, the way ASEAN reacts, and the way we achieve the objectives of, again, political and economic objective of ASEAN. So when we're talking about the geopolitical situations, next please. We have this. I know probably you're wondering why since the beginning I've even didn't mention about Trump, but suddenly here it is. Since 2016, yes? Was it 16? that he was elected, then the whole world sort of like changed. Am I correct, or is it only me feeling that way? Yes. Do you feel that way too, or no? Yes. How about our friends from Europe? Do you feel the change in the geopolitical situations with the election of Trump? Or it's only me or Indonesian people? I don't know. Yes. So when we're talking about the ASEAN geopolitical environment, one of the things that we cannot be separated is the elections of Donald Trump. Completely different with the previous president under Barack Obama, which is not only because Obama was having his childhood for short period in Indonesia. Do you know that? Anyone knows that Obama was spending very short period of his childhood in Indonesia? Yes? No? Okay, so not because of that, obviously. That I think Indonesian people love Obama more than Trump. I don't know. Not because of that, obviously. But then, yes, election of Donald Trump, because that has changed the architecture of the global political economy. And then it highly influenced ASEAN, obviously. Especially the US strategic policy under Obama used to be inclining more to Asia, but now, no. So that obviously has a very significant change in ASEAN development. The second thing, we have discussed it briefly earlier, the rise of China, and we're talking more about the South China Sea dispute, for example, and how does this affect ASEAN. And we're also cannot separated ASEAN from Japan as the dominant power in Asia. In addition to Japan, we're discussing the role of India, Australia, and then the last one, a very recent development of ASEAN, is the ASEAN position regarding the new terms on Indo-Pacific. If you haven't heard that before, we're going to discuss that later. But then also, we're going to discuss it and how then the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific will also influence the future development of ASEAN. First thing first, the election of Donald Trump. Next, please. Why this is important? One of the reasons why then the election of Donald Trump has a significant influence towards ASEAN is because his foreign policy attitude. With his slogan, using the America first, the US now has becoming much more what we call as the protectionist as compared to America before or under the previous president. The US now is becoming much more aware of, say, their trade relations. So one of the things that Donald Trump is always keep repeating, is that the US now in a very problematic situations because of the deficit of their trade issues with some countries, not only with China, also with Indonesia as well. So targeting these countries to have much more sort of like balanced trade relations. So the US has a very protectionist policies since Donald Trump was elected. Here we see that the rise of the US protectionism as one of the biggest challenges in ASEAN. And then the US position used to be, as I mentioned earlier, that under the Obama was much more closer to Asia, but no longer after Trump was elected. So the US now, some people say that the US leadership in the global political economy is declining. And the question is whether there will be the next new power resuming the absence of US leadership or not. Some people say the rise of China gives different sort of like attitude. The rise of China, some people say that as the new hegemonic power is rising, but was it really true or not? Next, please. China recently has become a very important player in a global political economy. In a one hand, we see the declining hegemonic or the US leadership in the global political economy, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of global political economy in more general sense. The rise of China can be seen at least for the last couple years. And one of China's characteristics is its expansion not only in Asia but also in some other parts of the world. Anyone has heard about BRI? Yes? Belt and Road Initiative. Anyone? Do you know what it means? Yes. Yes. What it is? Why it's such a big deal? In a one hand, we see the declining power of the US, but then now we see that the expansion of China through what we consider as their projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. What was that actually? Yes.
The Agro initiative is what gives it much impact towards the global market is China's building a more efficient trade route towards all regions that they intend to have trade relations. So that includes one of the massive scandals project, like in Malaysia itself, is the railway project, which will become efficient trading route to transport goods and whatnot. And along this route also, there has been, and along these trading routes also, there has been it's not Chinese settlements, but it's development of China industry areas along this route. So that is what I believe is the big issue about the Road and Belt Initiative.
RI is Chinese project in ensuring the access to both the markets and also the access to the resources that they needed for their own development. However, in that sense, they're also investing in building infrastructure along the way. Used to be, it was regarded as the Silk Road when you travel the goods coming from the other side of the world to China. Then they're building this kind of massive infrastructure supported financially by Chinese government, and it was built by the Chinese companies along the way. Then the countries that, part of this, including Malaysia and Indonesia as well, there were some issues regarding, say, how then this infrastructure can influence the development of the country. Some countries, they were in debt to China because of this infrastructure, massive infrastructure, but some countries see that differently as the new opportunity. So the rise of China is seen as, quite diverse response. Some countries are much more welcoming, some countries are much more reluctant. So what we see even in ASEAN is almost the same. One of the aspects of the rise of China is including the dispute regarding the South China Sea. Here I put that the growing weight of China will be also influencing ASEAN significantly, because ASEAN, when it comes to China, has no single voice. Am I right? See, I think the ASEAN members countries will understand that. Every individual ASEAN member has different interests and different sort of like policy objectives regarding China. So ASEAN is having difficulty to have a single unity or unified sort of like voice when it comes to China. I think I have it in the next slide. Next, please. So here is the area that has been the center of the dispute. Why then South China Sea is very important, not only because of the strategic location, but also some areas having a very lucrative, resourceful natural resources. So it's not only about the strategic locations, but also the endowment, but also the natural resources in this area is also very lucrative. So that's why it has become one of the unresolved disputes, not only among the ASEAN members, but also with China. You can see from this map that China claimed the one with the red line, Malaysia claimed the one with the yellow line, Vietnam claimed with the blue line, and then the Philippines, I think it was purple. I'm not so sure with Taiwan, was it pink or something? But then again, about Taiwan, we cannot consider Taiwan as a country if you are with China, right? So it's a bit kind of difficult to put how you put Taiwan, because if then, like Indonesia has an official position, one China policy, meaning that Taiwan is not considered as a country, but it is part of China politically. Officially, that was the position that was taken by the Indonesian government. A very what is it? The form of this kind of position. If you're a civil servant, if you're the Indonesian civil servant, and you're using the official passport, then you cannot go to Taiwan. You can use your ordinary passport to go to Taiwan, but not your official passport, like the civil servant passport. Because if you're civil servant, then you have the blue passport, and then you have the green passport, right? Since Indonesia officially acknowledge only one China policy, then you are unable to enter Taiwan if you're using your civil servant or the blue passport, but you can enter Taiwan with your green passport. That was only intermediate, right? Just a story that was how difficult it is for the Indonesian civil servant. I don't know whether ASEAN members also apply similar. No. Malaysia also acknowledge one China policy or no? No. Taiwan is a country. Wow. Okay. Anyone from Thailand? Yes. Do you know the official position about the Taiwan from the country? Do you acknowledge like one China policy, or Taiwan is a country like Malaysia? No? One China policy. Like, yes. Okay, similar to Indonesia. Anyway, so next please. So here is why then South China Sea is an important issue, because again, it's the most important waterways, and you can see that trade passing through this area exceeding like 5 trillion per year. So it's a very big money coming across this area. And it's not only about the natural resources, but also fisheries are there as well. So you can see that why then these countries are eagerly want to claim the South China Sea as part of their country. Indonesia is not part of the dispute on this South China Sea. So that's why now, until now, ASEAN members still have no single voice when it comes to South China Sea, because not only because we also have this dispute with China, but also among the ASEAN members. The way ASEAN deals with China and South China Sea issues will also affect the objectives or the way that the ASEAN can achieve the ASEAN single market and regional economic integration. Next, please. This is the last development that last time China lost the arbitral tribunal between the Philippines and China, 2016. But then, as we know, it's still ongoing. That China still doesn't accept the decision. Next, please. Now we're talking about Japan. As I mentioned earlier, Japan was the traditionally very significant actor in ASEAN. Prior to China's rising, Japan was the largest trading partners for most ASEAN countries, but it was recently replaced by China. Despite the fact that Japan was part of the colonial power during the World War II, but the ASEAN members' acceptance toward Japan is much more welcoming as compared to China and South Korea. Yes, you have question. Sorry.
About the China before.
Okay, can you get back to the previous slide? Yes.
Before you said about influence and power, and by actually talking about power, you're talking about bargaining power between the countries involved, right?
Yes.
And by that, ASEAN have lower voices compared to China, and then we have with ASEAN and 6 countries, what does it call?
RCP.
RCP. Yeah. Is it? Do you think it is actually being a way to actually decrease the tension between the dispute that is happening in Asia, or actually it is threatening and giving space to China to actually take over? Giving influence to the Southeast Asia.
Interestingly about China is regarded as, in terms of security, some of the ASEAN countries regarding China as a threat, okay, because of the South China Sea claims and all those things. But on the other hand, we see that in terms of the economic relations, most of ASEAN countries see China as much more a positive way. So it's, what I see here is much more like when hate and love collides kind of thing. When we see China to some extent, oh, okay, well, this is a new threat for our security issues. But at the same time, we realize that we're trading much more with this big giant country. So then resolving between the security threat in one hand and then the interdependence. Probably I'm much more optimistic to see interdependence rather than dependence, yes? Interdependence, economic relations, on the other hand, always become part of the dynamic relations between ASEAN and China. So you see that in terms of the security issue, China is seen by some ASEAN members as a big threat, especially for their own security issues, for sovereignty, and all those aspects. But again, on the other hand, the data shows ASEAN members mostly trade with China. So reconciling these two sort of like positions, hate at the, on the other side, and then love because of the interdependence in regarding the economic relations, it's always becoming parts of the dynamics relations between ASEAN and China. RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, for some people is considered as a way of ASEAN members to probably to see China much more in cooperative way. But we're still in the process. It hasn't settled yet. It's still under the negotiations. So we'll see, because it hasn't agreed yet. It's still ongoing process. So we'll see whether the security issue will more sort of like prevail, or the economic interdependency will be much more, have more say in ASEAN and China relations. In case of Indonesia, I think Indonesia is much more in the position of the not really sort of in the position of what is it, like antagonistic with China. Really, really careful. Again, because of the economic relations is too high to be, it's too risky to jeopardize the economic relations with the big giant country like China, for example. So again, here we see that that's part of the dynamics of the relations of ASEAN and China. Yes? Anything else? I forgot. I completely like jump into the next aspect without asking if any other questions. Questions probably about this? So why then South China Sea is very important, and why then the ASEAN members have a very different positions, again, because the interest of each country is also different. And one side, some countries realize that it's a very big threat for their security issues. But on the other hand, in terms of the economic relations, there's so much more going on, and it's just too risky to risk anything related to the economic relations. Another thing is the rise of China is also seen as the alternative for the existing trade relations with what we call as the traditional trading partners, usually with the US, the EU, Australia, and some other countries. With the rise of China, some countries see that as the new opportunities to have different trade relations with the existing relations, especially the past relations with some much more developed countries like the US or the EU. Why? Because, for example, with the Indonesia's case, some of the Indonesian products are having difficulties to enter both the EU and the US market because of the standards, environmental standards, labor standards, and all those things. While when we're having trade relations with some developing countries like China, well, we're still considering it as the developing countries to some extent. Very different sort of like trade relations and different standards regarding the labor standards, regarding the environmental standards. So for some people, it was seen as the new opportunities for their market. Not only because of the existing relations with the hegemonic power were seen sometimes as problematic, but then again, because the new development of the rise of China has also given for some countries are new opportunity. But on the other side of the coin is the security threat is also real. So that was part of the dynamics between the ASEAN and China. Anything else from China? Is it okay? Yes? Not okay? Japan. Now, next, the role of Japan. As I mentioned earlier, Japan was considered as the traditional trading partners for most of the ASEAN countries. Japan was also seen in a better outlook as compared to the way South Korea and China see Japan, especially due to the historical colonial problems. You know that Japan was colonized Asia back to during the World War II. Yes, okay. It wasn't not as clear as other history, and that was always becoming the issues between South Korea, China, and Japan when it comes to the acknowledgement about what happened during the World War II. But as I mentioned here, Japan is viewed by ASEAN members in much more positive way, despite the fact that there has been some issues during the past colonial period or during the World War II. And Japan was has a very significant role in economic development in ASEAN countries, economic development, building infrastructure, investment, and all those things. So now, especially like Indonesia, we see like the competition between the investment coming from China and the investment coming from Japan. Again, in that regard, the rise of China is seen as the new alternative to the existing investment or the trade relations with the previous or dominant countries. But Japan is always has an issue regarding the security due to, again, the World War II. Japan is probably is not seen as the hegemonic power, especially in terms of the security, because Japan has no sort of like army except for self-defense. So that's why uncertainty over the role it plays in defense and security as compared to any other hegemonic power that have interest in ASEAN regions. Next one. Other than China, US, Japan, geographic situations of ASEAN is also attractive for some other big countries, including India and also Australia. So this is the one that I mentioned earlier, that regional comprehensive economic partnership is a venue for ASEAN to integrate and accommodate trading partners outside the ASEAN member countries. We discussed it briefly previously, but if you want to talk more about it, then we can discuss it later. But this is the fact of the role of India and Australia in ASEAN can be seen especially in the development of ASEAN external relations. That was the one that I mentioned earlier, that ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus China, South Korea, and Japan started from 1997. It was way earlier. And then ASEAN plus 6, which include not only China, South Korea, Japan, but also India, New Zealand, and Australia, when it becomes the regional comprehensive economic partnership of ASEAN. Someone mentioned about Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't really remember who it was, but yes, oh yes, you. It was true. Initially, we knew there was an initiative on Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some ASEAN members also belong to this initiative, but then after Donald Trump was elected, the US withdrew from the TPP, left the rest of the countries. Now they developed the new initiative under the CPTPP, and at the same time, some people consider that the initiative under the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership can be gaining the momentum since the TPP was already left by the US. It was a bit kind of excitement during after the withdrawal of the US 2017, but then starting from 2017 and until now, the negotiations under the RCEP was still going on. People are still wondering, oh, it seems like the RCEP is also having difficulties to achieve sort of like trade agreement as they expected earlier. So these are the members supposedly of the RCEP, including New Zealand, Australia, China, obviously, and then the India, South Korea. Okay. Last, next, please. Now we're talking about the recent development. Earlier, I mentioned about the objectives of ASEAN to establish what we call as the single market. And it was in the forms of the ASEAN Economic Community. The fact that ASEAN is situated in a very strategic locations, then ASEAN has also faced what we call as the challenges due to geographical conditions and the interest of the hegemonic power or big power surrounding the regions, right? Then how then, the question is then how then ASEAN responds to it, right? Only few weeks ago, It was the last high level or ASEAN senior officials meeting was held in Bangkok a couple of weeks ago. Those from Thailand, did you know that there was a meeting in Bangkok back then? Yes. It's the official meeting, and they came to sort of like a statement that ASEAN now will adopt what we call as the Indo-Pacific, or what they call as the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Why it is important, and how does this relate to the way ASEAN responds to the challenges due to the geopolitical situation? First thing first, Indo-Pacific, if you see from the map, it was actually trying to integrate and accommodate India as part of the picture of the only Asia Pacific. Used to be the most common terms that we used to acknowledge this region is the Asia Pacific, right? Somehow it was sort of like diminishing the existence of the Indian Oceans or the India, as if India or Indian Ocean was not part of Asia, isn't it? Because it's only like Asia Pacific. But then the US introduced the new concept, which was Indo-Pacific. Then interestingly, ASEAN now also adopted the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. It was the new concepts and the strategy of ASEAN acknowledging that the region is no longer only Asia Pacific, but also to include Indian Ocean's regions as part of the dynamics of the whole sort of like region. So no longer only Asia Pacific, but then it includes, as you probably we can go back to the map. Sorry, can we go back to the map, ASEAN map earlier, just to show that how then the Indo-Pacific earlier concept is relevant to this map. You see, right? Used to be only the Asia Pacific, but now we see also include the Indian Ocean regions. It's, how do you see? Is it good, or is it, how do you see this in terms of the terminology or the concept? Is it more inclusive? Is it problematic? How do you see this? Is it good development for ASEAN? Yes? No? Or no idea? Is it new concept to you too? Have you heard this Indo-Pacific concept before? Or you have heard that before? No? New? All right. This is good to some extent, but then problematic on the other hand. Why so? Can we go back to the slide? Yes, this one. Why this is good to some extent and probably problematic on the other hand? The concept of Indo-Pacific is heavily influenced by the US perceptions on the region. And China was reluctant to adopt the concept because on the one hand, the US initially has already introduced the concepts of free open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, as against to the Chinese concepts on the Belt and Road Initiative. You see here, right? The rivalry of these two powers. The existing hegemonic power under the US, and then the rising power under the China, right? So on the one hand, the US has introduced the concepts on Indo-Pacific with terms of the free open, while on the other hand, China has this new development on the Belt and Road Initiative. Why it can be problematic? Because we need to wait China's response on ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Probably in terms of the concept, it was fine, but when we're talking about the original concept that was introduced initially by the US, then it can be problematic because China is reluctant using the concepts due to the free and open sort of like adjective when describing the Indo-Pacific. While now ASEAN is much more comfortable using it as part of the ASEAN strategy. So in terms of the rivalry between the US and China, this can be problematic until we will see the response of China regarding the new adoption of the concepts ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Especially because the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific also adopts some of the principles including like transparency, more inclusive. Can we go back to the previous slide? So here ASEAN adopt the new sort of like concepts of the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific with the principles on here ASEAN centrality, yes, probably that will be good. Openness, transparency, inclusivity, rules-based approach, and all these things, which then probably can be problematic because some of these principles are regarded as offended from the Chinese perspective. Openness, transparency, you know what I mean, right? So that's why, again, how then the implementation of the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific still questionable because it was just introduced 2 weeks ago, and it was, some say that it was initiated by the Indonesian government. So we see the next slide. It was, next slide please. This is the quote from the president. Now it's already elected, yes? No dispute about the president, or still, I don't know. Well, the president mentioned about here that this outlook represents what we call as the centrality and force of ASEAN in upholding these principles, including like peacekeeping, strengthening cooperation, and all these things. Why this is important? Because until now, since 2016 or probably 2017, the trade war between the US and China had not shown any sign of the reconcilement. So that's why the trade war between these two big countries becoming the concerns of ASEAN. So ASEAN needs to respond to it with the new concepts, the new strategy, and how then it will be the guidance of ASEAN in developing its future cooperations, especially with ASEAN external trading partners. So again, here we are still waiting the future and probably more practical way and how to implement this Indo-Pacific concepts, which just recently adopted by ASEAN. So next one, please. Last one. So in conclusion, relief, isn't it? It's almost like 2 hours. Is it? My goodness. Anyway, here the concluding remarks. ASEAN's core objective is obviously trying to sort of like geopolitical balancing, as we see previously that the strategic locations of ASEAN has put ASEAN in that kind of position. ASEAN has to deal with many sort of like competing rivalry interests among these different big powers. Obviously will influence the dynamics relations both within and between ASEAN and some other countries. Here also the purpose of the establishment of ASEAN, again, still until now becomes one of the principles of ASEAN is non-interfering, non-intervention. ASEAN, due to its geopolitical situations, may have a very huge opportunities for economic cooperation, but at the same time also ASEAN has to face a various range of political risk. And then this is responding to the new development of the negotiations under the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which represents ASEAN's willingness to expand the cooperations not only among the ASEAN members, but also expanding to the major trading partners. And then last but not least is the new concepts regarding the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, which I mentioned earlier, we still need to wait and see how it can be implemented, and how then we are still waiting of the response from the major powers that surrounding ASEAN, and how it again also influence the dynamics relations within ASEAN and also between ASEAN and its trading partners. We still have time. If you still have more questions, please do so. Any questions so far? Oh yes, you first.
Well, I want to ask a bit about the Asian economy. So basically, the recent figures the free trade between the Asian countries, such as goods, services, and labors. So when talking about labors, I am curious: is the trade itself is creating a downside, like an increase in unemployment when talking about labors? Because there will be some labors who aren't competent enough, so they fail to compete with another labor forces from another country. How does ASEAN respond to this kind of rising problems? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's interesting. We also have to remember that when we're talking about labors, the aspects of trade in services, especially in terms of labors in ASEAN, is related to the professional workers. And I believe that in Indonesia, especially when we're talking about the unemployment and stuff, usually skillful laborers, they are much more resilient, they are much more competitive, they are much more able to compete in a way as compared to probably unskilled laborers. So under ASEAN, the one that has been agreed to be traded, yes, it's the skillful laborers. And I don't see, at least until now, any issues regarding the competitions among these skillful laborers. For example, because again, I think, for example, Indonesia, when we're talking about the massive infrastructure that the government is trying to achieve now, I think there are shortage of skillful, engineers and all those things. So we're talking about the skillful laborers. And so far, sorry, I don't have the data yet, but so far I think skillful laborers are again much more resilient, and then they're much more competitive as compared to unskilled laborers. So in that sense, I guess the reasons why ASEAN is only focusing on, having the trade agreements in services for specifically on skillful laborers, because they realize that was much more manageable than talking about the unskillful laborers. While probably for those who are not coming from Indonesia or ASEAN, know that Indonesia is also having an issue regarding unskillful laborers that work in probably neighboring countries, including Malaysia and also in Singapore, for example. So unfortunately, those issues are still not yet part of the agreement. We will see how far or when they're going to be part of the negotiations. So again, it's much more about the skillful laborers, because again, some of the ASEAN countries are still in need of those skillful laborers. So that's, again, in my opinion, is much more manageable instead of like talking about the unskillful labors, which still an issue. So that's why I think ASEAN is trying to avoid, in my opinion, bigger issues regarding unemployment. So that's why they're only focusing on certain aspects of the skillful labors. Okay. Oh, okay. I saw you. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Raja. Here, I would like to know your prediction about, that lately Sri Lanka has regarded as the victim of China debt trap. I would like to know your identification. What is the long-term effect if a country get the trap on the China debt trap? Thank you.
Yes, I think it's been on the news regarding the Sri Lanka's debt issues with China, and that was regarded as one of the examples of how, for those who criticize the rise of China as part of the issues regarding how dangerous or how problematic the rise of China is. Uh, One of the reasons is also because I think in any issues regarding foreign debt is always related to the domestic political situations. Some countries are able to cope with the issues if they have a very strong domestic political infrastructure, domestic political system, mechanism, and all those things. So the thing is, why then the result of Chinese sort of like expansion in some countries are various is also because it's not only one variable, the Chinese investment or Chinese financial, support and all those things, but also it relates to the political economy conditions of the countries receiving the foreign debt. So some countries are able to manage that, some countries are unable to cope with that. So that's why Sri Lanka is different story with the other cases. But one of the things that we need to be more careful is regarding, you need to have a very strong domestic mechanism, strong domestic political economy sort of like governance. So this in that regard, then you will be able to be more resilient, and then you are going to be able to cope with any external pressures. So how then we are going to overcome in the future? Then you have to clean up the mess domestically first. That will be a very strong conditions. Otherwise, then it's going to be very difficult. Indonesia at this moment, I think, will be having much more chance to be able to cope with the issues as compared to Indonesia probably 10, 15 years ago, when our domestic, domestic political economy situations is also not as good as the current situation. So again, that was also related. So two variables that we have to consider, that this foreign invasion, I don't know how you call it, like through the debt or whatever, but then also the domestic political economy situations, the strong bureaucratic you have, the strong macro economy you have, that probably you have more chance to overcome, and then probably will be much better in coping with all these kind of external pressures, including the foreign debt. Yes. Sorry, I need to go to this side first. Yes.
So, some news that I read, it's like Indonesia initiated the Asian outlook in the Pacific, and it may seem like for China, Indonesia it's like leaning to the U.S. power because of the openness and transparency. And how do you see Indonesia's position in this rivalry situation between those two?
Official position of Indonesia. Those who are familiar with the Indonesia's foreign policy, you may remember the terms of rowing between two reefs. Have you heard that? You know rowing? You know rowing, right? Rowing between two reefs. In bahasa Indonesia, mendayung di antara dua karang. So the used to be, it was the terms that used by our founding fathers to explain the Indonesia's situations during the rivalry between the US and the USSR. Indonesia is rowing between these two reefs. So what we want to do is not taking side. That was the official statement of the Indonesia's government. The similar position is still official statement of the Indonesian government is not taking side of these two rivalry between the US and China, especially during this trade war. However, again, in practice, you see some of the differences and then some of more sort of like pragmatic in a way that we see the US as becoming much more protectionist. On the other hand, China is providing much more alternative to the source of development. So probably that can be seen as also a bit kind of the dynamics of the Indonesia's positions regarding the rivalry between the US and China. But again, if you ask me, then the official statement of the Indonesian government is now Indonesia is also facing similar situations that we have to rowing between two reefs, and then not taking side is the official statement of the Indonesian government. A very strategic, careful position, right? Because you have to do it in a very diplomatic way. Surprisingly, with the Indo-Pacific, sort of like ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, it seems like, as you mentioned earlier, that the terms that were used are much more or closer to the US idea. But then I'm not really so sure in practice it's going to be as clear as that one. Probably still in between. And then we'll see, because again, Indonesia is still having the principles of the foreign policy, free and active sort of like foreign policy, and strategically rowing between those two reefs. I'm afraid that we're running out of the time, and my apologies that I may not be able to respond your questions, but can you put the last slide, please? I leave the email address, so if you still have questions, I don't know, please feel free to email me, and hope that, I know that I'm the first speaker for the lecture, yeah, rather than the CEO this morning. Hopefully it gives you, the big picture about ASEAN, and hope that you're going to enjoy the rest of the weeks for this, I think, great opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your such an interesting lecture, Dr. Poppy.